Tom Kovach is an Air Force veteran, and we got a little echo there. Uh, Air Force veteran, and has been following the TWA investigation since 1996. He joins me today. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jason. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's wonderful to have you. You and I have spoken briefly on the phone just the other day to set up this interview, and I was just so interested by so many of the things that you were saying. You've been involved with some of the people who have historically done some of the best investigation into this. James Sanders, why don't you tell us your story?
Okay. To begin at the beginning, I remember the night when it happened. It was an unusually hot day and a hot evening. If I remember correctly, I think the surface temperature at the airfield was still uh, in the 90s, in the low 90s, just before the aircraft took off. And of course, the airliner took off from JFK, and that was about 8:30 in the evening, turned eastward, followed the coast of Long Island, and exploded shortly after takeoff. And on the 10 o'clock news, I just happened to be flipping channels that evening. I was still living in upstate New York at the time in the Binghamton area, and I was flipping the channels on the TV and happened to go by WNBC, which uh, I've had some connection to them in the past. So I paused to watch the news, and I saw with my own eyes the eyewitness video that they aired, and that video aired only that one time, disappeared, has never been seen publicly since. But an eyewitness recorded a streak of light rising up from the ocean surface and striking Flight 800. And that video was very consistent with a video of a missile. For example, if you see on the TV news, a lot of times they show when there's an attack upon Israel, and they'll show rockets or missiles inbound. That's looks the same as what I saw on TV. There it is, Chuck Scarborough. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is 50th anniversary, so maybe they've changed it, but this is ABC New York. You know, like you, I remember it. I wasn't watching the news necessarily, but I uh, grew up on Long Island, and I was on Long Island July 17th, 1996. I remember this very, very clearly. And, you know, of course, my interest in this disaster has only grown because I have had the unfortunate circumstance of coming to interact with someone who has become very important in this investigation. She was the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of New York at the time, Valerie Caproni. And of course, she was there. She is the one who told the NTSB investigators that the FBI did not want conflicting information. So how did you become involved in the investigation, Tom?
Well, this is a funny story in a way. I was grocery shopping, and I was walking through the grocery store, and I went past the book section, and I just happened to turn my head, and there was the book that you showed on screen a minute ago, James Sanders' book, The Downing of TWA Flight 800. And it just caught my eye instantly. And I said, I have to have that book. Well, I bought the book. I don't think I read the entire thing in one day, but uh, I couldn't put it down. Uh, and I ended up uh, calling James Sanders on the phone, and he spoke with me for a while. And he recommended me to a group, which at that time was fairly new, called FIRO, which stands for the Flight 800 Independent Researchers Organization. The founder is a physicist named Tom Stalcup. At that time, he was still a candidate for a PhD. Now he has it. He uses the Spanish pronunciation FIRO, but FIRO, potato, you know, that was the organization. We had about 50 people, and I used to joke that I was the least qualified member of the group. I was a law enforcement supervisor when I was in the Air Force. And before I joined the Air Force, I was a cadet in the Civil Air Patrol, which most people have never heard of. But the Civil Air Patrol, during its heyday, was the premier search and rescue organization in the United States. And I was an honor graduate of their Ranger School. And so I was trained in search and rescue, crash site security, aircraft crash intelligence, that kind of thing. And so after I read the book, I was like, wow, I need to get involved with this. I reached out online, I found the group, joined the group, and James Hallstrom, the FBI Assistant Special Agent in charge for New York City, who led the FBI's investigation, branded us, quote unquote, a band of internet kooks. Well, let me tell you about these internet kooks. You have a PhD in physics, you have an MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology professor of radar. His name is Graham Sefton. He was the co-chair. There was a former Navy fighter pilot turned airline pilot turned airline crash investigator. That was Ray Lair. And there were a number of other people with high qualifications like this chemist, metallurgist, et cetera, et cetera. But Kallstrom said that we were a band of internet kooks. By the way, James Kallstrom coined the term conspiracy theory. And so it gets used a lot, but the original use of that term was talking about Flight 800 and our assertion that a missile strike brought down the airliner.
I think a lot of people remember that they started calling people conspiracy theorists about the JFK investigation as well. And, I just found out, I was surprised by this coincidence. The Sanders, they got involved in a lawsuit. We'll get into that in a minute, but their attorney was a guy named Mark Lane, not the same Mark Lane who wrote the book Rush to Judgment about the Warren Commission and the JFK assassination. But it is interesting how the FBI and the government basically brand anybody a conspiracy theorist if they start investigating what frankly appears to be a government conspiracy. There's an incredible amount of contradictory and conflicting evidence surrounding this destruction of TWA 800. And as you said, a large number of extremely qualified experts have found that the FBI's conclusion just doesn't make scientific sense.
Agreed. Let me jump in on that qualified expert thing. And in my personal opinion, one of the most unique pieces of scientific evidence that came out of the investigation was a metallurgist. I don't remember his name, but he was contracted by the Aircraft Mechanics Union, and he was able to be in on the reconstruction uh, in the hangar in Calverton on Long Island and examined the wreckage, and he found traces of a chemical compound called PETN. Now, PETN is a very unique chemical compound, and it comes from only one source. It is the residue left behind after the burning or the detonation of an explosive. And in this case, a military grade explosive was a compound called RDX. Well, after you explode RDX, it shoots out uh, particles that leave a residue, and that residue is PETN. Well, he discovered the traces of PETN on the beams in the wreckage that was reconstructed. And so he put forth the assertion that there had to have been a military grade explosion. Well, the FBI countered and they said, oh no, that PETN residue came from an explosive dog detection dog training exercise that happened months prior. Well, that's ridiculous. And the reason it's ridiculous is because, first of all, as I said, the PETN is created by the explosion. So if they had a training exercise aboard the airliner and then they found PETN afterwards, that would be because the explosive training aid blew up. And then everybody would know because it would be on the news, et cetera, et cetera. But that didn't happen. So going back to what I said earlier about joking that I was the least qualified member of the group, but this, what I call the dog story, uh, put things into my world. Because when I was in the Air Force, I was a law enforcement supervisor. I was not a canine handler, but I worked with canine handlers and I had several that were friends, et cetera, et cetera. And so I knew the rules and the parameters for these explosive detection training exercises. And first of all, you do not bring a live explosive training aid aboard the airliner while it's being serviced. So it takes about 3 hours to turn around a 747 airliner after it's parked at the gate and all the passengers have deplaned and they bring aboard the various crews, the cleaning crew, the galley crew, the restocking crew, fueling, et cetera, all these different people in different parts of the airplane. You do not bring the explosive training aid aboard while those people are doing their jobs because you would needlessly put all those people at risk. But there was one other parameter, and this is where my training and experience came in handy. You see, I was trained that when you investigate a historical incident, you try and gather all types of other information from outside the source and the crime scene, things that cannot be tainted by anyone that might have been involved in a crime. And so I obtained from it's called NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which oversees the weather records and everything. And I obtained the weather records for that month. And on the night when the FBI purports that that aircraft was involved in an explosive training exercise, there was an active thunderstorm in the immediate vicinity of the airport. You do not bring the explosive training aid out of the safe storage facility in a thunderstorm. Hello. So they lied about a number of things. Now, James Sanders and Jack Cashel also investigated the dog story. They came at it from a different angle. Um, Jim Sanders, having been a police sergeant in Riverside, California, he also looked at the investigative angle and actually tracked down the airport police officer that was purportedly involved in uh, documenting this training exercise. But the paperwork does not show the tail number of the aircraft. Now, those types of records are supposed to be very precise, including the exact aircraft, i.e., the tail number, the time that the exercise starts, the time that the exercise ends, and anything that happens during the course of the exercise. So the paperwork does not note the aircraft tail number at all, whether it was Flight 800, which off the top of my head, I believe the number was November 19319. I'm not 100% off the top of my head, but it was something very similar to that. Anyway, there is no tail number on the paperwork. Uh, there is no flight number on the paperwork. The paperwork simply says a wide body. Well, that could be a seven. There we go. November 93119. So yeah, I think I was right. Um, Nobody would be that generic on a properly filled in document. So, in my opinion, that document was filled out hastily after the fact by someone that was nervous about possibly getting caught falsifying evidence. And so the dog story didn't happen. And the PETN did not come from the dog training exercise. No way, no how. Uh, just didn't happen.
I agree with you. And I mean, it's just one of the really anomalous aspects to the case. You mentioned James Sanders, who unfortunately has recently died, but he was really out front. Him and his wife Elizabeth was a TWA flight attendant and lost a lot of friends and colleagues on the flight. They had sued the United States of America, the Attorney General, James Hall, who was the NTSB chairman, the director of aviation safety, Kallstrom, who was the assistant director of the FBI, and this person, Valerie Caproni, who was the assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of New York at the time. And I guess that's what would have been covering Suffolk County, New York. It's interesting. I just saw this lawsuit for the first time last night. My interest in Valerie Caproni, she's a truly evil, corrupt woman who today is a U.S. District Court judge. And at the time, she was just starting her career, or in the middle of her career, I should say, as a U.S. attorney. But within 72 hours of the disaster, Valerie Caproni was dispatched to Calverton within 72 hours. And on July 21st, just 4 days after the crash, while the NTSB was investigating, Valerie Caproni, who, as far as I know, has no technical expertise as an aircraft disaster investigator, despite the famous Italian aviation manufacturer Caproni. Maybe she's related, I don't know. But she informed the NTSB personnel who were investigating the crash, including the operations group chairman, Weimeyer, that no interviews were to be conducted by the NTSB, but the NTSB could review FBI-supplied documents. And if no notes were taken and no copies of those documents were made, the FBI informed the NTSB personnel that the reasons for this action were because the FBI did not want conflicting information. And her actions, relegating the NTSB to an inferior position in the probe, were a violation of this statute here, which I guess governs air crash disasters. But what do you think about this? Did you know much about Valerie Caproni? Have you heard about her or her involvement in the case?
If my memory is correct, Valerie Caproni was a co-author of a book with James Kallstrom about the incident, and I never read the book. I have a healthy mistrust of anyone that was involved in that aspect from the government side of the house, so to speak, because it was obvious from the very beginning that there was a cover up involved. And in my conversations with James Sanders, he brought out some very interesting facts, some of which are mentioned in his original book, and some of which came out months and even years later, related to the two FAA warning uh, areas off the coast of Long Island. If I remember correctly, those were Whiskey 105 and Whiskey 107. And so when there's a military training exercise, um, the FAA can activate what's called a warning area. And then if any other aircraft not involved in the exercise approach that area, the air traffic control will warn those pilots to change course and do not enter those areas. Yes, there we go.
Yeah, I mean, see, your military and Air Force background is very useful in understanding a lot of this stuff and these details. I was not aware of Valerie Caproni having authored a book, but actually, just in searching for that right now, you've helped me find something that I've been looking for many years, which is this is a copy of an interview with the Corporate Legal Times where this guy, Robert Vosper, interviewed Valerie Caproni, and this has been expunged from the earth with an enthusiasm I have rarely seen. I've actually spoken to Robert Vosper trying to obtain an original copy of this. The only time I've ever seen this has been a copy that Jack Cashel sent me that James Sanders had emailed to him. And this is fascinating. I'm going to have to post this on X for people to read because Valerie Caproni says a number of things in this that give us insight into her personality and her deep corruption.
Yeah, I purposely avoided reading that because I didn't want to taint the research that I was doing at that time. So, and I know the name, I know the position that she occupied, but I didn't read her work. And God bless Jack Cashel. That man, he can he can dig deep, and he has a pretty strong stomach for that kind of thing. And I do too for some things, but um, I don't earn a living writing. So I've done all of my research while I had quote unquote regular jobs after my Air Force career. So I didn't dig as deep as Jim and Jack did, but nonetheless, had my hand in it.
Let me just read you a bit of what this article says about Judge Caproni relative to TWA 800. On July 17th, 1996, TWA Flight 800, bound for Paris, crashed into the Atlantic Ocean off Long Island after taking off from JFK at 8:31 p.m. All 230 people aboard died. Because officials at first believed it was a criminal act, some witnesses said they saw a missile hit the plane. The FBI and Caproni were brought in to investigate and ensure the site was treated as a crime scene. That meant that the National Transportation Safety Board, which normally investigates plane crashes, was pushed to the sidelines. That fueled rumors that the feds were covering something up. Caught up in these rumors was Caproni, who conspiracy theorists accused of running roughshod over the NTSB during the first few days after the accident. Apparently, she made it quite clear that the FBI was in charge and the FBI would conduct all interviews with witnesses. In addition, Caproni ruffled some feathers when she charged James Sanders, a freelance journalist, for removing a piece of the wreck in order to test it in a lab for explosive residue. To this day, some people still believe terrorists blew up the plane or that a wayward Navy missile struck it and that Caproni tried to silence witnesses and journalists. Caproni laughs at the accusations, and she says conspiracy theorists came out of the woodwork before the last piece of the plane hit the Atlantic. She says this was the most thorough investigation that had ever been done. We followed every lead, and there was no doubt that the plane exploded. It was not brought down by a rocket or a bomb. It exploded because of the center fuel tank. Anyone who believes otherwise has not listened to the facts. Now, I've personally interacted with Valerie Caproni. She is a liar and an evil, horrible human being. What do you think of those statements, Tom?
Well, that was a very carefully worded statement. And it's kind of like when Bill Clinton said, I did not have sex with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. He was sitting there uh, and looking out over a group of people. And as soon as he said it, I had this picture in my mind of I did not have sex with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. You know, it's how you parse the words. So in Peroni's statement, she said that the airliner was not brought down by a rocket or a bomb. Okay. Well, the average person hears that and they think, oh, okay, without thinking about the fact that there's a difference between a rocket and a missile. So I've I've caught officials in lies like that before, very carefully worded. See, it was not brought down by a rocket or a bomb. It was brought down by a missile. In fact, 3 missiles by my analysis. So very carefully worded, but also very misleading, in my opinion.
Now, 3 missiles. We had a conversation with Jack Cashel and Captain Al Francis last week, and they said it was 2 missiles. I was very compelled by Captain Al's evidence. He talks about a rented fishing boat that was discovered at an alternate marina that had been cleaned completely, was rented by a guy described as looking like he was from the Middle East, used a fake ID, a stolen credit card, and I separately have spoken with Felix Sater, who said that he felt that it was taken out by a man-pad, a man-portable air defense system like a Stinger missile, one of which had originally been provided to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Help us understand what your conclusion is.
Okay, there's a whole lot there to pick apart, and I think you're on the right track. Absolutely. Uh, Jack Cashel, and I've talked with Jack for off and on for 20 years now. Um, Great guy, very, very smart man. Someone, and we don't know who, sent Jack a very large document. It's about 3 inches thick in a binder, and it was called the Engineering Review. And this review goes into tremendous detail about various aspects of the wreckage and the condition of this item or that item, and a tremendous amount of detail. Whoever wrote this document was very well trained and had inside knowledge of the reconstruction inside that hangar. Well, Jack put it out there in one of his columns that he would provide copies if anyone was interested. So I contacted Jack right away. He sent me a copy, and I read the engineering review. Now, Jack believes it's 2 missiles. I believe it's 3 missiles. But either way, the airliner was brought down by at least 1 missile. Now, I'll give you the condensed version of my conclusions. The airliner took off. There was a boat out on the surface of the ocean, launched a missile up toward the airliner. And as they do, sometimes it went above the airliner, arced in, locked on, and then began to uh, zoom toward the airliner. As that was happening, the Navy was offshore conducting a training exercise. Very interesting that the training exercise scenario just happened to be a boat on the surface of the ocean with a shoulder fired missile about to attack an airliner. That was the scenario of the training exercise. Mere coincidence? Well, draw your own conclusions. But a second missile was launched to intercept the first missile. So again, here's the airliner still climbing out of JFK. The missile comes up behind, arcs down, and is zooming in toward the airliner. A second missile is launched, presumably by the US Navy, to intercept the first missile. But the first missile strikes the tail of the airliner before the second missile is quite in range to take it out. So when it hits the tail of the airliner, it violently changes the attitude of the airliner. It pitches up. The second missile goes underneath the airliner because it's been pitched up. The second missile, again, in my opinion, was what's called a Bomark missile, a Bomark warhead, which has its main ingredient, so to speak, is called a continuous rod warhead. And the simplest comparison I can give you is a toy called a Slinky. If you remember Slinkies from back in the 60s, it's a spring that children used to play with, and you'd go like this and it would move back and forth. Well, picture a Slinky that's both ends are welded together, and then in the middle of it, in the middle of a donut, so to speak, is an explosive charge. So when this warhead detonates, it sends this coiled metal out very rapidly, and it's superheated and it's traveling at a supersonic speed. And because of the combination of heat and supersonic speed from the explosion, it's able to slice through the thin metal of the skin of the aircraft. Okay. And there's a video that's out on YouTube that demonstrates a Bomark at a testing ground, and they had a number of steel beams uh, planted into the ground all the way around where this warhead was. Then they detonate the warhead, and you see this piece of metal fly out, and it slices all the steel beams simultaneously. So, oh, looks like we have it right there.
Is this the right one?
No, sir, that's a launch failure from 1959.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's maybe difficult to find. So, but it does
Yeah.
seem like,
Anyway,
yeah. Please continue.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I mean it seems like there was a missile fired by someone on the fishing boat, and I mean it's just amazing. I definitely want to hear more about your conclusions about the whole thing.
Okay. Well, I spent an hour interviewing retired Air Force Brigadier General Bernard Parton. He was the inventor of the Bomark warhead. And he explained to me in significant detail not only that it had to have been a Bomark warhead that did that damage to Flight 800, but also that no other existing warhead could do the same damage. So that narrows it down significantly because only the United States had the Bomark missile warhead. So the second missile, the Bomark, was launched to take out the Manpad. Now, a little bit of a sidetrack. There were some people that tried to discredit FIRO's presentation by saying, well, it couldn't have been a Stinger missile because the altitude ceiling of the Stinger missile is only, I believe it was 11,500 feet, and Flight 800 blew up at 13,800 feet. But there are other shoulder fired missiles made. If my memory serves me correctly, there was a Polish made model in particular that had a ceiling of 18,000 feet. So well within range of this other missile. And so, anyway,
Sorry, Tom, isn't it also true that there's some variation that when they say the ceiling is 12,000 feet, some of them will go 10,000, some will go 13,000, and also there's some discrepancy as to the specific altitude that the plane was at, right?
now the altitude of Flight 800 was fairly well established because they were not that far away from the FAA aircraft surveillance radar at Islip, Long Island. But um, there could have been a slight discrepancy, but it wouldn't have been 1,000 feet or more. But to your point about referencing altitudes, um, I have to frame this part very carefully. The official Air Force fact sheet for the SR-71, the spy plane, which has been retired now, but stated that it could fly at altitudes in excess of 70,000 feet. And most people will go, wow, 70,000 feet. Well, that's really high. Key words, in excess. And so I have heard stories about how high they really flew, and it was definitely in excess of 70,000 feet. And so when somebody gives the uh, ceiling of a missile, for example, they don't want to give away all the tactical advantage. So they'll say an altitude uh, of approximately such and such.
Yeah, this says
Yeah, so 12,500 feet. So it
altitudes
could have
ranging
reached
from
more even.
500 to 12,500. Right.
Yeah. But regardless of the model of missile, the first missile was the shoulder-fired missile from the boat on the surface of the ocean. The second missile was the one with the Beaumark warhead, which was sent to intercept the first missile. But alas, here's the problem. The second missile, after the first missile struck the tail of Flight 800 and did not yet detonate, it struck the tail and forced a violent pitch up and literally bounced off the horizontal stabilizer and then uh, unzipped the side of the fuselage. And if you look at the pictures of the wreckage, you'll notice that there is damage, a streak of damage about 18 to 24 inches wide. Yes, right there in the picture that goes up the side of the aircraft. And that damage was caused by one of the fins of the missile traveling at supersonic speed, and it actually cut into the side of the airliner and produced that gouge. Well, while it was doing that, the second missile was supposed to intercept the first missile, but when that violent pitch occurred, then the second missile tracking targeting radar accidentally locked onto Flight 800 instead. And so it went up underneath the airliner and got just short of the cockpit and exploded and sent out that continuous rod warhead right there. And that produced a slice, and the front half of the aircraft fell off. And that's why the eyewitnesses in 3 states saw 2 pieces of the airliner falling out of the sky. That airliner was sliced clean by the Beaumark warhead. Well, when the people on the ground, the Navy people, realized that the Beaumark had accidentally locked onto Flight 800, they sent a third missile to intercept the second missile to prevent it from striking the airliner, but they were too late.
Wow.
So 1, 2, 3, boom, boom, boom. And that's essentially what happened to Flight 800.
Wow. Really something else. Now, this something that I had raised in my conversation uh, last week or whatever it was, 2 weeks ago with Jack Cashel and Al Francis, where there was all this stuff going on in the years prior, where the Navy had accidentally shot down an Iranian commercial jetliner, and that was kind of a big deal that there was a lot of controversy about. I became very interested in investigating who was on the plane. I'm accused of being a conspiracy theorist. Everybody who has investigated this, as we saw, was accused of being a conspiracy theorist. So I found this. This was an article from the Washington Post. This was published in the days after the incident, and it basically spoke about all these different people. And one of the names, really, the name that stuck out most to me was this guy, Charles Beatty, who was a senior systems engineer with the Naval Surface Warfare Center in Dahlgren, Virginia. Have you ever heard about Charles Beatty, or do you know anything about him?
I've heard mention of him, but I never did any research into it. I didn't bother with the who aspect of it very much. I've heard several rumors um, regarding who was aboard, but uh, I liked what Jack said in his interview with you about a week ago when he said that, excuse me, there was no person aboard that airliner that deserved their own personal missile. So there are some interesting possibilities there, um, but I don't have any particular red flag to say, yes, this person could have been a specific target. I think the more likely scenario is that the terrorists simply wanted to strike fear in the New York City area because New York City is the most Jewish city outside of Jerusalem. And so the terrorists wanted to be able to say, hey, we can get this close. And that in and of itself would have been a propaganda victory for them.
But wouldn't they shoot an El Al plane if they were going to do that? I mean, why TWA?
Could have merely been a target of opportunity. Could have been that they were there for the purpose of striking an LL airplane, and the takeoff times were maybe a couple minutes apart, and they shot the wrong airliner. I mean, anything's possible in that regard.
I'm interested in this guy. Again, I hear what you're saying. I don't say that he deserved a missile. I'm just saying I find it so strange that someone who is involved in this type of, surface warfare. I mean, this guy, he's writing about all these kind of missile technology. He's simulators used in deception. I don't know. It just seems like all this top secret cloak and dagger stuff. I've heard that there's allegations that this is the way that they assassinate somebody, because then it doesn't become about an investigation into an individual assassination. Look at how much controversy has shrouded this whole thing. Even people who've investigated it for decades, nobody thinks about Charles Beatty. I don't mean to ask you to speculate. I don't want to focus on somebody that we don't have a lot of evidence about, but it's just interesting to me.
And that's the problem. When I first got involved with this, we had a number of brainstorming sessions within FIRO. And uh, at first, uh, the topic of discussion was such that nothing was off limits, and we could speculate and we could throw out various ideas and then evaluate them. But as we gathered evidence, we began to narrow the focus, and Tom Stalcup was very adamant that we didn't want to go public with speculation. We wanted to stick to the facts, and that was good advice then, and 30 years later it's still good advice.
Absolutely. Are you still in touch with Tom Stelkup? He's still involved in investigating and making documentaries, right?
I copy him on some of my tweets, and I've watched his videos, but the last I knew, he was up in Massachusetts, and, I've lived in Tennessee for 25 years, and our paths don't really cross. Also, the, email account that I was using at that time is defunct, and so, I had his email address, but I don't have it anymore.
He ran for Congress, it looks like.
Yeah, nice guy, he's very smart.
Yeah.
Um, there was a federal court hearing on Long Island, and that was held mid-morning. Um, I went to it. I rode the bus all night from Binghamton to get to it after having worked the day before. And I was there when Jim and Liz Sanders were sentenced for the uh, alleged crime, purported crime that you mentioned earlier, of having removed a piece of evidence from the hangar, mailed it to an independent lab. They analyzed it and they determined that, just like what I said about the PETN earlier, the only source of PETN is the detonation of a military grade explosive. Well, the red residue from the fabric of the uh, cabin seat, passenger seat in the cabin, was determined to only have come from the burning of solid rocket fuel. Uh, by the way, um, a lot of eyewitnesses heard two explosions, and I said there were three missiles. The first missile apparently did not detonate, uh, and I believe that what happened was, after it struck the airliner, caused a violent pitch up, bounced off, went up the side of the airliner, that it later exploded in front of the airliner at the same time that the Beaumark missile exploded beneath the airliner. And that would have been the first boom that the witnesses heard on shore. Then the second boom they heard was the third missile that was sent to intercept. Now, I'll interrupt that for just a second to say there is another possibility, and that is that uh, the controllers on the Navy ship, when they realized what was happening so rapidly, could have disarmed the third missile and then it never exploded. But either way, that would explain why the witnesses on shore heard two explosions, but there's most likely three missiles involved.
Yeah, I mean, another thing, you bringing up the Navy, another thing worth mentioning, people who've been following closely will know this already, but also just very, very strange that then President Bill Clinton had this executive order 13039 excluding the Navy Special Warfare Development Group from the whistleblower, basically saying anybody in the Navy who knows about this and says anything is not going to be protected as a whistleblower. I mean, that's really, really crazy and highly suspicious, if you ask me. I want to ask you about this, Tom, because you sent me this graphic about the horizontal stabilizer trim system. What does this have to do with the incident?
Okay, that device right there on the screen, that is a jack screw. And that particular one, it's called the horizontal stabilizer pitch trim jack screw. Try to say that 5 times. So the job of that jack screw is to cause the trim surface to move up and down like this to uh, make minor changes in the attitude of the aircraft. So you have the horizontal stabilizer, which can move, and that makes big changes up or down. The aircraft will move up or down. The trim surface makes small changes, and those are often computer controlled and they occur quickly, and that's what keeps the path of the airliner smooth. So this jack screw, if you see on the on the graphic there, it says the Acme screw. That's the main thing that's involved there. And if you look in the trunk of your car, if you have what's called a scissor jack, that you can be on the side of the road and you turn the crank and it opens up like a pair of scissors, and that'll lift your car off the ground so you can change a flat tire. Well, that screw is about as big around as my index finger. Okay. Some of them are even on smaller cars are even smaller, like my pinky finger. But the one on that airliner is about as big around as my elbow, and it's about 5.5 to 6 feet long. And that's controlled by that actuator motor that's shown there with the gearbox. And the job of that jack screw is to move that trim surface up and down, uh, and it's very strong, and it turns very quickly. Well, that jack screw was fractured by the impact from the missile. As I showed earlier, the missile first arced up until its radar locked onto the aircraft, and then it came down while the airliner was climbing. And when it struck the tail of the aircraft, it caused that violent pitch up and then bounced off of the horizontal stabilizer and continued on in a parallel path. Well, that happened so quickly and so violently that it fractured that Acme screw on the jack screw assembly. The amount of force that it would take to fracture that is phenomenal. Uh, there was a photo in the article that I wrote, the column that I wrote, where that same graphic came from, is a photo of a jack screw from an Alaska Airlines crash, and you can see the size of that jack screw. Well, that jack screw from the Alaska Airlines crash survived the crash, okay, intact, and yet 13,800 feet in the air, a jack screw is broken. That takes an enormous amount of force, and that force came from missile number one.
Pretty inconsistent with an explosion in the center fuel tank.
Negative. There was no explosion in the center fuel tank.
Yeah,
The thing that
inconsistent, I'm
broke the
saying. Inconsistent.
oh, inconsistent. Yes, I thought you said consistent.
No,
I'm
no, no,
sorry.
no, no, no.
Yeah, yeah, the combination of the speed of the missile, the impact, the metal to metal, coupled with the violent force, and then now you have a 500-mile-per-hour wind suddenly blowing in a different direction than it was half a second ago. All those forces combined fractured that Acme screw.
Wow.
And that took a tremendous amount of force. That's why I wrote that column and I titled it The Rosetta Jack Screw, because just like the Rosetta Stone that was discovered that enabled archaeologists to translate from Egyptian hieroglyph, say that 5 times fast, hieroglyphics into ancient Greek, that Rosetta Stone was the key that enabled that translation. The jack screw is the Rosetta Stone of the Flight 800 crash.
Amazing. And of course, Valerie Caproni and all of the FBI would say that all of this scientific evaluation is conspiracy theory. I don't believe them for a second. I want to let viewers know that they can support you, Tom, and your research by sending you a contribution through Venmo using this QR code. You could just point your phone at the screen. Tom is just an independent investigator and journalist, and it was kind of you to share your time with us today. We could speak about this for hours. Is there anything else you want to discuss before we wrap things up, at least for this first conversation?
Um, I'll mention very briefly a thing called the Bruntingthorpe test. It was done in a town called Bruntingthorpe, England. And all these people that say that the airliner was brought down by misting fuel in the center wing tank, it's impossible. I knew guys that were in Vietnam that just for fun would walk by a cistern full of jet fuel and douse their cigar in it. The aircraft fuel, jet fuel, has to be misted at a certain proportion in order to become explosive. The liquid jet fuel, like I said, guys used to douse their cigars in it just for fun. So what happened was they tried to recreate this explosion, and they started with jet fuel in a tank and a 28 millivolt spark, which is what they determined that the so-called broken wire that produced the purported spark that caused the whole thing to crash, and it was only 28 millivolts. Well, if you walk across your living room in the wintertime across the carpet and touch a brass doorknob, the jolt you get is about 3 times that spark. Okay. So that didn't blow up an airliner. So they kept trying to recreate this explosion, and they kept changing the proportions of fuel mixture. And eventually, the only way that they got a test fuel tank to explode was that they replaced the jet fuel with propane. So, of course, they got that on video. Oh, here's the fuel tank exploding just like we said it would. Only that one was filled with propane. So that is the length to which people had to go to try and debunk the findings that our group uh, put forth.
Really unbelievable. And it just seems like, as much work that's been done, there's still more questions than answers. I know there's a lot of people working to try to reopen the investigation, and I really appreciate you joining me today, Tom. I want to remind people they can sponsor Crowdsource the Truth by going to crowdsourcethetruth.substack.com or subscribestar.com or patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. Tom Kovach, it's a pleasure to speak to you, Tom. I really enjoyed the conversation, and we'll have you back soon to discuss some more.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Just trying to control the echo there. And thank